It's a busy time between Europe and China. Since the end of last year, we've almost lost track of the number of visits by leaders and senior officials from both sides to each other. But Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Qin was the most recent one. From the 8th to the 12th, Qin visited Germany, France and Norway, during which he proposed 3 principles for maintaining stable relations. China likes to propose principles, I know, but they can illuminate our path ahead when, and I would even say only when, the right principles are laid and agreed upon, can there be certainty. So what exactly are these principles? What has been achieved as a result of such diplomacy? What remains to be done? And what does it have to do with you? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Paris by Sébastien, Périmony, researcher of Schiller Institute in France. From Shanghai by Professor Jian, Junbo, Deputy Director of the Center for China-Europe Relations at Fudan University. From Beijing by Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University. And here in the studio in Beijing by Einar, Tangen, Senior Fellow of Taihe Institute, a think tank. The warmest welcome to all of you. Sébastien, let me go to you and thank you very much for getting up at this inconvenient hour to participate in our show. Now, we have actually, as I said, been looking at a string of visits by leaders and senior officials from both sides. From the European side, for instance, since the end of last year, the more prominent ones that come to mind: German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Spanish Prime Minister, French President, and of course there are also the European Commission leader and European Council leader, so on and so forth. And from the Chinese side, we have Vice President Han Zheng, we have Wang Yi, China's top diplomat, and of course now Qin. So how do you look at the whole background of Qin's visit? Where does his visit fit in to the sequence of events?
So what I can say is that it's fascinating to see the increasing activity, diplomacy of the Chinese with the EU, because let's say in Europe, we are in a kind of ambiguous, or not to say schizophrenic situation, because we went from the characterization of China as a systemic rival, in 2019, and since then the China-EU relation was very not so good. You have a lot of neoconservative and propaganda in Europe concerning China, and so now you see that the relation is going to, at least China wants to stabilize the situation, and some in Europe wants to. But we cannot say that we have a unified Europe today. For example, you have 2 cases. That's the case of a German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock. You went to China saying that we have to stop the human rights, narrative, and so on and so forth, to which the Chinese foreign minister said that they don't want to be lectures on human rights, by the West. And you have the French minister, Mrs. Colonna, who said that China is very important for peace and stability in the world. So today, of course, some people want stabilization and some don't want it. So you don't have a unified Europe today on this question of the normalization with the relation with China.
So probably against that backdrop, Qin proposed the 3 principles, as I mentioned, for China-Europe relations last Friday. He called for the adherence to an inclusive worldview, the commitment to a progressive view of history, and win-win, as I translate. Professor Jian, let's get down to the details, if we can, in such a short period of time. What exactly do these principles mean? For instance, the inclusive worldview. What does Mr. Qin, or what does China want to say about it?
I think there are several meanings. First, politically, it means China hopes European Union or European countries to mutually respect each other's social and political systems, and not, so-called systemic rivals between Europe and China. And economically, I think it means to find chances to strengthen cooperation in the future, and not de-risk or decoupling. And the third I want to say, in global governance, China hopes that EU can European countries can find a chance to cooperate in global governance to deal with the global issues. So I think there are, but I want to say some points may be accepted by the European side, but some others will not be accepted. So I think it's better for both sides to find the common ideas, and then according to the common ground, they will find some common actions to strengthen the cooperation in the future.
Rick, watching all of this from your perspective, what is new about Qing's proposal this time, and how do you look at the reactions of European countries during his visit this time?
Well, I don't think that there is a lot new in terms of the rhetoric. I mean, China has talked about win-win cooperation since the days of Deng Xiaoping. But I do think these principles are something that you can't really disagree with. The idea we should be inclusive rather than exclusive. The idea basically that we should have a progressive view of history, which would mean that we should not look at the years when Europe was an economic colonizer and a military colonizer of the rest of the world. That we should respect everybody. But it's all, I mean, really, what's important here is how it plays out. And what you can see right now is China is trying to repair relations with the European Union that were damaged greatly during the pandemic and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where there were some severe sanctions that China has had problems with. And the United States is talking about trying to even ratchet up sanctions. And I think what China is trying to do is to try to show Europe that Europe can be an independent player, that Europe does not have to be dependent on the United States. It's not us against them.
Einar, what is your take on these principles and the announcement of them? You were nodding your head when Rick was saying that there's not much new that come out of it, but still, why does he decide to highlight these three messages? Win-win, of course, it's a long-standing position of China, and then inclusiveness. What does he mean by inclusiveness here? You know, when you talk about China-Europe relations, who does he have in mind? And also when he talks about progressive view of history, I'm sure he's not talking about, I'm afraid I don't see it as him talking about Europe in the colonizing as a colonizer, but rather during the Cold War days, you know, Cold War years when countries were picking sides according to their ideological camp. So your take, Einar.
Okay, so let's not dance around the elephant in the room. This is aimed squarely at the United States. China is very interested in seeing which way Europe is going to go. This will have profound geopolitical and economic consequences. You know, recall the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of trade with the European Union. Was kind of a bellwether. That's why people wanted to, that's why they had the Belt and Road Initiative, backdoor to Europe. But if Europe decides that it does not want to be in the same sphere as China, if they keep talking about de-risking, which I don't know the difference between de-risking and decoupling is, there will be changes. You'll see the Belt and Road Initiative swing even more to the global south and to Central Asia. And obviously, you can see what's happening with Russia. I mean, one of the big issues for the United States post the fall of the wall was they did not want Europe to get together with Russia. Russia's resources and Europe's manufacturing ability could challenge the U.S. Inadvertently, though, the U.S. has pushed China and Russia together, as well as the global south, making an even more formidable economic and political influence in the world, not domination the way the U.S. has done it. So you have very, very big movements that are happening here, and Europe has to decide. And as pointed out by our colleagues, they're very divided.
They're very divided, but it seems that the effort has been going on to decide. And the latest development on that is on the 12th of May, which is on the day when Chinese Foreign Minister left, an informal meeting I don't know whether there is any, connection between these two events, but it happened that the day was the same day. An informal meeting between European foreign ministers took place in Stockholm, where they discussed behind closed doors a paper on EU's China strategy. And according to the media, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell said they backed reducing the bloc's economic dependence on China, but will now have to figure out how to make that a reality. But he also stressed that the EU should not subscribe to an idea of a zero-sum game whereby there can only be one winner in a binary contest between the US and China. So Sébastien, let me get back to you. Do you think this informal meeting is important, or does it mark kind of a milestone in EU's effort to find its unified policy on China?
Yes, it's really a big fight inside the European institution between what I said at the beginning, because those who want to sabotage the EU-China relationship and those who want to stabilize it. And during this meeting of the foreign minister, you have this discussion about de-risking with China. And Joseph Borrell himself said that, he said exactly that China is simultaneously a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. So he repeats it. So you have this debate. So it's very important that Germany and Italy said, no, we don't want to have this debate about systemic rival. We will not support this paper, and we will go for stabilization of the EU-China relationship. So I think it's revealed, the fight inside Europe to have a normalization with China in a period where you have to understand that we are in the brink of a financial crisis in the US. We are systemic financial risk. So everybody's talking about that. So, of course, the stabilization is fundamental, to face this situation.
How much dependence, Professor Jian, how much dependence exactly does Europe have in terms of supply of critical resources from China? Because that seems to be on the European leaders' lips all the time, that they're only getting their critical supplies from China, so they have to diversify. And how do you measure this kind of dependence?
I want to say, can I give a very short comment about the change of the European Union's policy toward China? I don't think this meeting in Stockholm is a milestone policy change. But, of course, a very big change because they, strengthened the rivalry, systemic rivalry. But the position, the partner, the competitor, and the rivalry, and this position, I don't think they have strategically changed. About the dependence, I want to say, from the point of the European Union, there are several strategic dependence on China, on China's market. For example, especially the rare materials. I think this is the biggest challenge for the European Union. And some allergies, such as some sun allergy, for example, solar allergy. So I don't think there are so many, so much higher dependence on Chinese market in many fields. In some fields, I think they have some dependence, but I think there is also so many cooperative chances for both sides.
Well, from my understanding, European leaders were really, as Professor Jian just talked about, they're talking about semiconductor, solar panel, batteries, 5G, 6G, raw materials, of course, and critical minerals. Einar, let me go to you here. Is that a risk, really, and how can you prove that by sourcing a lot of these materials from China or from any one particular market is a risk?
Well, it's the risk actually is the opposite way around. As the United States has found, when you start imposing these kind of artificial changing the market, you actually increase prices for your people. Right now, they have a tremendous amount of inflation. I don't think it's good to underestimate the number of intermediate goods that are produced in China that are actually used in Europe and a lot of European goods and services and things like that. So many things coming in, everything from chemicals. I mean, you look at the huge German chemical makers, they've actually closed their shops in Germany, and they've moved to China basically because they cannot produce competitively anywhere else. So things, but I want to draw attention to something that is not mentioned enough, and that if you look at inflation in the United States and also Europe, you'll find that the inflation is happening in the service industries, and these are these are tertiary economies where a tremendous amount of the economy is tertiary. So when you start looking at goods that are actually coming from China, that's not where the inflation is coming from. It's coming from within these own countries because people say, I want to have more money, I need more money to live. So at this juncture, they're not dealing with the internal pressures that they have from being tertiary economies and being so reliant in terms of economic means on these services and the costs of them.
Rick, your comments here, because as an American, you obviously have a very deep understanding of what Einar just talked about. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, I agree with him about the inflationary cost of de-risking. But right now, I think what Europe is doing, this whole idea of de-risking does come out of the pandemic when supplies were not reliable. And secondarily, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe realized how dependent it was for natural resources. And I think that is something that, I mean, in both of those cases, that's what Europe is thinking about. And yes, it will be inflationary, as Einar said, but right now, I think there's also another risk, and coming from the United States, but understanding both Europe and China. That is, there is an economic risk, a financial risk of the U.S. financial system right now. There have been a number of banks, of regional banks, that have been purchased at fire sales, and I think Europe right now does want to try to control risks, and the risks from China may have to do with some of these supplies of products, but from the United States, the question of risk, I think, has to do with the financial system. And both of these would be challenges to Europe going forward.
When you have over-reliance, let's say, in one market for some of your critical commodities, what should be the solution? Sébastien, I'm going to go to you, but before that, we all know that French president has just announced that a Chinese group from Xiamen called XTC New Energy Materials, they are planning to set up a joint venture in Dunkirk with a French company called Orano to produce a lithium battery for the European markets. That's an investment of 1.5 billion euros. And we're also seeing a Taiwanese company investing in that market with 5 billion euros of investment in also the battery. It seems to me that that is a way of de-risking if you're really talking about over-reliance for key strategic products. It doesn't have to be the other way around where you harm each other's interest. Sébastien.
Yes, it's very important what is just said, because it's not a question of de-risking. For example, Macron gave an interview in Financial Times a few days ago saying that we need more industry in Europe and we need more sovereignty. And we rediscovered that we need sovereignty. So, but Europe wants to be a superpower. You have this idea that Europe has to be a superpower to compete with the US on the one side and China on the other side. So this is not the right way to see it, which is not a multipolar world. So, and I think what it was said about the financial crisis is very important, because since the last 40 years in Europe, in the US, in Great Britain, we have only created speculative bubble with 2 quadrillions of dollars, speculative financial assets, nothing to do with reality. And what we have seen in China, for example, it was a physical production. So I mean, we are in the middle of a change, and the systemic risks of the financial system now push the West to change his idea about a new paradigm, a new world order with the push of the global south, wanted to work with China and Russia and not with the West. So you have all these dynamics, this new paradigm which is going on, and that pushed Europe to change this policy.
Let's turn to a very important issue here, and the latest development on that is China's Special Representative on Eurasian Affairs, Li Hui, will visit Ukraine, Poland, France, Germany, and Russia from today on, actually, to talk about Ukraine. So he will be the highest-ranking Chinese diplomat to visit Ukraine since the war broke out. Professor Jian, how central is that to China-EU ties, and how much obstacles and how much chance does he have in making some progress there?
I think Ambassador Li Hui's visit to Europe and also including Russia will a very positive action to promote the peaceful resolution on this issue. Of course, this is a very, very difficult task for him and also for international society. But I think this is the first step to, I think his visit will strengthen the mutual understanding between China and the European countries. And also, I think his motivation will, also exchange ideas between all the countries he will visit. So anyway,
Mr. Li
this
Hui
is a very difficult task.
Yeah, Mr. Li Hui was China's ambassador to Russia before. I actually talked to him in Moscow when I visited Russia a couple of years ago. But some people are saying that this fact erodes his neutrality. What do you say? Why does China choose a former ambassador to Russia as China's go-between person to resolve the Ukraine crisis?
I think this is a good factor to international society to promote the peaceful resolution of this issue. Yes, Ambassador Li was an ambassador in Russia, so I think his knowledge, on Russia and on this region will help him to understand much more than others about the history, the reality, and the relations between Ukraine and Russia. And I think he also can, communicate well, much better, I think, with all sides. And I think he's a very good person. Yeah, I don't think he's not a good person. He's a very good person to do this.
Einar, you were having all kinds of mixed reactions when I was talking about the subject. What is it? Why are you shaking your heads or nodding your heads?
Well, I mean, I really see the point of this as being about China showing through actions that it believes in the principles that Jingang was talking about. He's gone to Europe after they've, said, look, we're trying to get Saudi and Arabia and Iran together, and there seems to be some progress there. There's no guarantees. But also in Europe, what they're doing is they're the one actively proposing peace, what's happening in the US. And this is as much part of the message as anything. It's what you do, and you can say whatever you want, but you're going to be judged by your actions. And this is what China's doing. They don't believe that they can convince Washington to change course, but they do think that by leading by example, they can convert people, both governments in Europe and also people around the world, to the reality that they're not trying to start wars, they're trying to solve them.
But Rick, how do you look at the centrality that the European Union has put on the Ukraine issue on China-EU ties? You know what I mean? The foreign policy chief of EU actually said without helping to resolve the Ukraine issue, and especially by putting reason into Russia's brain, it would be impossible for China and the EU to improve their relations. How do you look at that? I mean, is the Ukraine issue so big that it has to overshadow the overall China-EU European ties?
I do believe it is central, and I do believe that that as long as Russian troops are on sovereign Ukrainian soil, that it puts China in a very difficult situation. And I'm hoping that having an envoy, a peace envoy, who was close to the Kremlin, is close to the Kremlin, was the ambassador, can be sort of a mini version of Richard Nixon Goes to China, when only someone who in Nixon's case was a strong opponent of communism could come and change the world, change things. I hope that this is the case. I hope that he can convince Vladimir Putin to leave Ukraine, to respect the sovereignty. But back to what you were saying, it's very important because Europe is united on this, that Russian troops should be out of Ukraine. But on the flip side, if China does manage to convince Vladimir Putin and then convince the United States to persuade or to put its pressure on the Ukrainian President Zelensky, and we do bring peace, I think that is a big, big plus for China. So I think that it has great potential to benefit China, but at the same time, it is essential that China actually get a response, convince Russia to change course, to actually change the dynamic here in Europe.
Sébastien, is that okay? Einar, you can't hold it.
I'm going to disagree. I mean, Rick and I are good friends, and we generally share opinions, but I don't agree with this. You cannot just purely see this as Russian troops on Ukrainian soil. I mean, Ukraine was put into harm's way by the U.S. knowingly going in and provoking Russia. They knew that this would happen. And this is not just in the last year and a half. This is something that goes back almost 9 years now. So what is also essential is that there has to be security for both sides. So this idea of just saying, well, Russian troops off the soil, if China can do that, then Europe will welcome them into the club. And it's nonsense. They see China as a systemic rival. They see value issues. I don't think that's correct. You have to look at the whole situation. It's not one-sided.
All right, Rick, you want to react before we go?
Yeah, I don't think all
please.
will be happy, but. Yes, I agree. I agree with Einar on that you can't just look at it, everything will be happy. But I think this is sort of a precondition of China changing its overall relations. And I think it would build a lot of trust if China could show some results.
Okay, Sébastien, do you see that as what's being expected of the Chinese envoy?
Yeah, the problem we have, in fact, the problem we have is not with people who want peace. You have a lot of people in Europe, even in the US, who want peace. Peace in Ukraine, peace with Russia. But the problem we have is with the people who want war. And there is a lot. Recently, the Hudson Institute at the Jamestown Foundation in the US organized a conference called Preparing the Dissolution of the Russian Federation. You have the Rand Corporation publishing a report say explicitly after Russia, China. So you have all these people fueling, the situation. And that's the real problem China has today, because there is a lot of people inside the European institution who are in the same neoconservative narrative. And that's the big issue, That's why there is a fight inside the institution. And that's the deal, because if we want peace, and China has understood that if we want peace, we have to replace, financial speculation by physical production. We have to replace geopolitical confrontation by mutual development. That's the peace plan that China has proposed. So we have to replace, cultural imperialism by a dialogue of civilization. And that's the point. That's the whole issue if you want to avoid a world war. That's why you have so much diplomacy right now, because we are at the age of the world war.
All right, we have to leave it there, unfortunately, but it's a very important subject and a lot of obstacles to clear ahead. Many thanks to Sébastien Périmony, researcher of Schiller Institute in France, Professor Jian Junbo, Deputy Director of Center for China-Europe Relations at Fudan University, Rick Dunham, Co-Director of Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University, and Einar Tangen, Senior Fellow of Taihe Institute.